Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to today's webinar, Managing Customer Engagement and the Network in the New Paradigm. My name is Michael Silber. I'm the event director of Enlit Australia, the conference and exhibition for the energy transition, which is focused on the entire supply chain from end to end. And we are pleased to present this live virtual event. We're also really happy to have a sponsor for today's event, and that's Smart Energy Water. So thanks to Smart Energy Water for sponsoring today's event. Before we meet today's panelists, there's a few housekeeping items we have to cover off. First, today's webinar will be available on demand after the live session. It will be on www.inletworld/australia.com. We've also added some attachments which are available they will be available through the handouts tab. That's important. The handouts tab is on the right-hand side of your screen. Next, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have any questions for any of our panelists and speakers, please feel free to send it through the Ask Staff a Question box, also on the right-hand side of your screen. And we'll be answering questions throughout today's session. But if we don't get to your question today, we'll try to make every effort. We'll try to make every effort to answer it afterwards and follow up with you. And last, we'd like to encourage you to share today's webinar with your social networks. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. I'd like to welcome my friend Rishika Diora, who's Strategic Marketing Manager with CitiPower, Powercor and United Energy. Next, we have David Prinz, who's a principal of Etrog Consulting, and he also serves on the advisory board for Enlit Australia. And finally, we have Richard McAdow, who's the executive chairman of Edge Electrons, and he's the former CEO of Energy Australia. And you can learn more about all of our panelists by clicking on the bio section on the right-hand side of the screen. During today's event, we're going to have a number of audience surveys, and I'd like to pop up the first survey question now before we kick off, if you don't mind. And we'll take a look at that and give you all a few minutes to answer that, and then we'll get into the discussion. And today's will be a panel discussion. We're encouraging a lot of interactivity, so please feel free to submit questions at any time, and we'll try to get to them. And I think that always works better than waiting until the end and having a Q&A session. So please feel free at any point to answer the question and or submit your questions, and we'll get right to them. I'd like to open today's discussion with an examination of the current energy drivers. I think that's a good way to begin. And there's a couple of things we're going to focus on, but we'll let the conversation go where it might. But we'd like to focus on the energy transition, decentralization, self-generation, perhaps a change in consumption patterns. So with that, I'd like to throw this to Richard and ask Richard to kind of kick it off and give us some of his thoughts on what he thinks the current industry drivers are.
Thanks very much, Michael. I'm going to share a little bit from some friends at BP Energy who do a lot of research into the industry and industry trends. And this a number of people may have seen this before, but it's an I thought this was a fascinating way to really encapsulate the challenges that we have as an industry from what is happening and the rate of adoption of renewables technology into the system. And here in Australia, we're seeing that faster than anywhere else in the world, and in South Australia, even faster again. So, if there's a crisis to happen, it's happening a network near you, and we are really, the lens of the world is on Australia. So this graph actually shows how rapidly that transition is happening with renewables. And it's interesting because, just to explain it, it shows how long it took a new fuel to achieve a 10% share of energy. So gas was first used as fuel for electricity in 1899. It's never actually made up. It's only just getting to close to 10% of renewable energy. Oil was introduced in 1877, and it took 50 years, just after the First World War, to achieve a 15% market share. You can see that within the 10 or the first 12 years of renewables generation coming in through the 2018, it had got to almost 5% of global energy. which on that trajectory, were it to just carry on that trajectory, means that within 25 years, it would have achieved 10% of energy production from renewables. But actually, what we're seeing is an even faster increase than that. And that's suggesting that at the current trajectories, we're going to see within 15 years of renewables coming in as and achieving 1% share, they will have achieved over 10% share of global energy supply. And that's the reason that the networks are finding it so difficult, because we're moving from a 100-year-old industry that has been a centralized generation industry where a generation plant was built where the fuel reserve was, and the coal fields of the Hunter Valley or the Latrobe Valley, and now it's becoming distributed generation with renewables sources, both coastal areas for wind and solar areas in Central Australia and on our rooftops. So this is why we've got the challenges. It's the speed of the transition that is causing the stress on the grid.
Rashika, do you have any thoughts on these ideas, these data points that were shared by Richard?
It's a graph that I'm familiar with. In the industry, it's one that we reference and we look at, and have looked at for several years. The only thing I would do is build on the complexity and segue into the consumer impact. So for the uptake of these fuels in the past, they may or may not necessarily have been linked to individual consumer decisions at the LV level, at the low voltage level. And so some of the challenges and opportunities that the networks are facing are the integration of renewables at an HV level, or at utility scale solar and wind generation, and integrating that into the network. But then also at a residential level in terms of solar PV uptake on rooftops. Those are two very different sets of integration plans that we need to account for. And 100%, the changes and the rapid adoption of technology in what we reference as behind the meter, so i.e. what you do in your home or at your business. People are making decisions in the best interest of their home or business electricity needs, which is absolutely valid. The consideration that needs to be taken into account in some ways is that those independent purchasing decisions actually have impacts back on the network and how the network operates. And that's something that there doesn't seem to be a tremendous amount of education around for consumers. And that's an area where we feel we can step in and provide some objective insight and objective advice for consumers, all from small scale consumers all the way up to community energy groups and utility scale solar as well.
Interesting points. Yeah, David, I know you do a lot of work on the retail end. What do you see as some of the key drivers from that perspective?
Thank you. One of the key drivers from a retail perspective, I'd just like to step back from that question and say, what has changed in the way that consumers deal with other retailers? How they buy their groceries, how they do their banking. Everybody expects everything to be available online. I'm just going to unmute and hopefully that's better. Yeah, so the way that people generally, as end consumers, expect other service providers, retailers to interact with them is completely changed. You're not waiting for your bank statement to arrive after 2 weeks in the post after the end of the month or the quarter or even the year to find out what your bank balance is. You're not necessarily going down to the shop to get your groceries. You're not necessarily browsing in the bookstore in your suburb. You're doing a lot of these things online. You're expecting to go online and instantaneously know what your bank balance is. If you pay a bill or you transfer money to somebody else, you don't expect to have to wait a few days while it disappears into a banking system and come out. So the same things are the sorts of things that people are expecting from the retail businesses. They're expecting some sort of Uberization, perhaps, where you can peer-to-peer trade, where you certainly can know whenever you want how much you're using, what your bill will be. So those sorts of things added to the things that my co-panelists have said about the ability to make investments in solar and other things. I think it's just generally how the world has changed, and energy needs to keep up with that. Well, actually, energy needs to is a bit behind and needs to come and step up to that, so that everything is on a similar vein, not left behind.
Rashika, you've spoken to me extensively about changing consumption patterns. So do you have any thoughts on that and how that's driving the industry or driving change in the industry?
I mean, particularly given the COVID environment, we're seeing some significant changes in how and when end-use consumers are using electricity. And it'll be interesting to see how that carries through into the summer period, particularly in Victoria, where we have both smart meters, but we're also experiencing more stringent lockdowns in some areas than other parts of the country. And so we would expect people to continue working from home. So you would expect to see continuous, load profiles that instead of, sort of looking like the duck curve that is the industry standard around there's a spike in the morning and then a bit of a gap when everyone goes to work. For the majority of consumers, again, on the residential side, we're seeing, stronger consumption during the day. And you would expect, particularly in the summer months, that's going to provide some challenges for folks as bills start to come through from the retailer. And so we're working proactively to try to, again, educate the consumer. And you'll hear this theme a lot, I think, throughout this panel, is education of the consumer and transparency of not data, but turning those data into insights that are relevant for the different customer segments, so that there's a clear value proposition for consumers that address electricity needs that they have, while also ensure that network operators can effectively manage the network to within compliance and regulatory obligations. So the changing consumption patterns, they're really based on two things right now. One, you've got the COVID environment, and two, with the increase in renewables, you're seeing what we call peak demand shifts to later and later in the day. And then that's driving interest in, okay, so what's the next, material tipping point in terms of technology adoption? How will the uptake of electric vehicles potentially impact that peak? What do storage solutions look like as we continue to sort of see, again, those behind-the-meter technologies become more and more commercialized for end-use consumers? There's a variety of things at play in terms of impacting consumption patterns. And one of the big guessing points is what's the next policy initiative that's going to come down the pipe, again, from a state level that might, drive some of this technology adoption and then further, again, affect consumption patterns. And how can we as a network truly understand or truly start to forecast and build into our system operations a technology agnostic operating methodology that allows us to accommodate these technology changes and help customers realize the full value of their investment, as David was talking about.
Thanks. Richard, you've commented in the past about the speed of regulatory changes is certainly affecting customers in their feeling about the industry. What's your thought on that?
I think that the regulatory change is so slow here compared to the need. And if I put this the other day in a slide, I don't know if you flick up slide number 4 here, but it's an interesting, it's just, I think it graphically shows what the challenge is. We have a network that is really not able to accommodate, sorry, the one before that. We have a network that is not able to accommodate the current changes. And when Andrew Dillon, who's the head of the Energy Networks Association, starts telling people that they're going to have to stop solar because we're going to get blackouts, the customer doesn't respond well to that. The regulatory framework, we talk about the regulatory framework, we talk about these challenges. The customer wants an answer now. David is absolutely right. The customer requires that answer now. And we don't have the luxury of spending 5 years for the Energy Security Board and networks to figure this one out. So unless the solution is available now, we will see those blackouts. But you can't tell customers you're going to stop them putting solar on their rooftop. And that's what's happening in South Australia at the moment. With South Australia, the current plan from AEMO is they're going to have to switch customers off to stop solar coming onto the grid. And that's just a politically unacceptable situation to be in. So, we talk a lot about this. There are solutions out there at the moment, but what I find, and I think a lot of people are frustrated, is the rate at which electricity networks will adopt those solutions, if they're not invented by the networks or invented in-house, is very slow here compared to other other countries.
Yeah, we're gonna get into that whole issue around solar further along in the conversation. I have a question, David. I think maybe you want to address this one, and it reads: in our experience with customers, they have zero understanding of who runs the distribution or electricity retail business. People also have little or no way to understand how their energy use can be changed for benefits either to themselves or the network. Would you like to comment on that, David?
Sure. Yeah, in terms of people have zero understanding of who runs the distribution electricity retail businesses, absolutely true, and it's true of gas as well. There've been a few surveys done by distributors who've done a quick 2 survey question to people, and question 1 is, do you know who your local electricity or gas, whichever they're asking about, distributor is? And maybe 60% will actually say yes. And that's actually quite promising. And then they'll say, name your local distribution business, and they'll name their retailer. So that's a failure of the businesses to actually get the message across as to who they are, which is partly the way that we envisage the industry when we split it up into retailers and distributors, that retailers would be the people who are interacting with the customers, and the distributors would be the boring poles and wires people, or gas pipes in the case of gas, that just sat behind the scenes and never really had to interact with customers at all. Now that is just completely wrong. It's the wrong paradigm. And more we're realizing why network businesses need to be communicating with customers. And we've come leaps and bounds in that, in terms of the engagement of customers with the distribution businesses as well as with the retailers. Picking up also on what Rashika said about, for instance, we now have the duck curve. So the duck curve is where the demand goes very, very low in the middle of the day, largely because of the solar PV that's being put into the system. So in the past, we told customers, well, change your behavior, shift your load, be more efficient, save money. How did you do it? You did it by reducing your daytime usage, because that was peak time, and you had people with air conditioners, and they were the big baddies. Of course, blame the customer is a key industry trait in all industries. It's not just the energy industry. It's always the customer's fault. It's because they switched on when they shouldn't have done, or they invested in all this air conditioning. And we need to be careful now that it's not all their fault because they invested in all this solar. But now that message is changing. Now people are more concerned in many cases about minimum demands rather than maximum demand. We're seeing tariffs where the peak is at midnight. The price of electricity at midnight is more expensive than at midday. Now, nobody is actually telling the customers about this or explaining to the customers about this. Customers are finding it very difficult to keep up. Well, what is it that you want from me now? Well, we need consistent messaging, and it's not the same message for everybody. And in a lot of cases, technology will help us, because technology will be a set and forget. If you have smart systems in your home, then those will take care of things for you. But that's still a fair way off for most people. And yeah, one of the key issues of this zero understanding is that it is complex, and we haven't in the industry necessarily always done the best job of doing that communication.
Thanks. You know, we have a lot of topics we're going to cover today, but we're also getting a lot of questions from the audience. So I want to stay with that. I think if the audience wants to, Rashika, you wanted to comment a little bit on provider awareness?
Only again to echo, you know, David's doing a great job articulating the challenges that the industry is facing. We've recently started some longitudinal market research with our consumers to find out, again, both exactly what you mentioned, what is the provider awareness for each of our distribution networks, and then what's the level of understanding of what that provider awareness actually is. So just because you can name Powercor, for example, as your network distribution provider, do you actually have a full understanding of it's not just the poles and wires, or and it's not boring poles and wires anymore. And I think David would agree with that. This is the place to be from an electricity perspective, because it's all converging at the networks in terms of enabling customer value proposition, both in front of and behind the meter. And that's one of the reasons why I think there is a very compelling message for customers to lean into their investment decisions, particularly in the early adoption phase, is that this, by engaging with the network, and it's incumbent upon the network to demonstrate that value proposition to the customer in a way that resonates with them, that you can maximize your solar investment, you can maximize your battery investment. You want to be, depending on your needs, and again, segmentation, as David mentioned, if you're an environmentalist or you're energy conscious or you're cost conscious, we can help enable the functionality associated with perhaps dynamic control that allows us to help better manage the network and demand management programs. You can receive compensation for that in areas where there are there's energy risk or constraint on the network, and it's a win-win. So we as networks need to become better at that consumer engagement, and we're doing a lot, and have been doing a lot in the past 18 to 24 months, and we'll continue to invest in consumer experience, consumer engagement, and trying to strengthen that relationship and trust with the end-use consumer.
Good. We have another question from the audience, which I think all the panelists would like to address. But before I get to the question, the question is, why would an individual consumer take action to benefit the network? I'm going to ask Richard to comment on that first, and then Rashika to follow, and then David. But as Richard's beginning to respond, can we put up the answer to the first survey question? The results of the first survey question?
Right, so the individual customer will respond when you make it worth their while. This is a low engagement product. They're not really, they expect it to be available for them when they switch the light on, light is switched on and off. These problems of network stability and everything else, they're not interested. They've spent 100 years expecting it all to be there for them. So to make them respond, you have to give them the financial incentive to do so. Now, that is possible to do. You can change people's consumption patterns by education and advice on data about when they're using electricity and how they're using electricity. We have been, as an industry, woefully poor at doing this and explaining to customers in dollars and cents and carbon what their electricity consumption means. We talk about kilowatt hours, we talk about voltage and amps and current and frequency. Customers don't care. They're interested in dollars and cents and carbon. And as an industry, we need to start talking to them about dollars and cents and carbon. And I think that customer data shouldn't be a obscure smart meter readout. It needs to be translated into something that people understand, just like they understand their electricity bill now. 20 years ago, everyone would come home from holiday and they'd spend $3,000 on roaming charges, and they were really annoyed about that, and they were really pissed off. And you know what? People are pissed off now when they suddenly find that their solar isn't working because the voltage is too high, and it stopped their solar from working, or their battery's not working because voltage is too high. So we got to put the customer at the heart of this, not the infrastructure, not our networks.
Rashika, any thoughts on that one?
Completely agree. I think the only challenge that I would articulate, and I don't think anybody's going to find this shocking, is that takes an incredible amount of coordination and understanding consumers in terms of where there's transparency that's required across the industry, but transparency with an understanding that not every consumer is going to want to be an active consumer. So I think David or Richard mentioned it previously about how it needs to be a set and forget, but you need to be able to have transparency into that process as well. So one of the challenges for us as a network around solar voltages is we've mandated the use and enablement of smart inverters in Victoria. All of the distribution companies got together and made this a mandate. And it's, the design there is that instead of your solar, your rooftop solar tripping off and then you not being able to export, that the inverter can actually throttle back and forth or up and down in terms of its export, so that you're reacting in real time to the power quality. And that's a great thing for customers. What we're finding is that the solar installers perhaps need a level of support and education from the inverter manufacturers on how to actually enable those, depending on the inverter manufacturer and inverter type. And so in some cases, this isn't happening. Smart enabled inverters aren't getting set properly. So the only thing I'm trying to demonstrate is it's a complex value chain associated with ensuring that the customer is able to maximize the benefits that they expect to when they make those types of investments. And we as a network, again, we want to work collaboratively. We're working with OEMs, original equipment manufacturers for inverters, and I think we're very open to working with the changing environment.
Okay, before we move on to the next topic, we had a comment on the power crisis in California that I'd like David to comment on, and they said that this attendee said that during the recent power crisis in California, I heard a comment that overselling fluctuating wind and solar without sufficient storage has been a major oversight. And David, would you like to comment on that? And then we'll move on to the next topic we have on the agenda.
Yes, sure. And some of you may have seen my comments on this on LinkedIn in the last few days. I think it's too early to say exactly what has happened in California in August with the rolling blackouts. Everybody seems to be accusing everybody else. But it is certainly true that I'm getting a bit of background noise from it is true that you certainly need something new or existing to be in place when you get more wind and solar come in. Essentially, the wind and solar can't be controlled. It can't be dispatched. It's intermittent. The sun shines, the wind blows, the generates, the wind blows, the wind generator generates. And our systems have been designed based very much on the central control. So when those fluctuate, you do need something to come in fast. Storage is definitely part of the answer. The big battery that's been put in South Australia is helping with that a lot. The latest integrated system plan from AEMO is forecasting a very large increase in the need for electrical storage in the next decade or longer. So without commenting exactly on what was the cause in California, definitely bringing in large amounts of solar and wind intermittent generation, which isn't controlled, without other things being brought in at the same time to deal with that, is a recipe for disaster. And thankfully, this is something that everybody here has recognized. AEMO is putting a lot of work into working out how they deal with that, and there are solutions afoot.
Okay, I'd like to move to another topic, which is more specifically customer needs. And we actually have a question that leads right into that discussion. And this question is in the UK, a key issue is that people did not trust, in capital letters, trust utilities, especially around energy efficiency. Why would you want to help me use less of your product? What is your view on utility trust in Australia versus competitors such as telco or technology companies? And that really leads us into our next discussion topic. And why don't we start with Richard on that one?
Okay, so this was an issue that we wrestled with a lot at Energy Australia, and all the retailers have this. Why would you sell less electricity to a customer? They don't trust you when you say that. If you actually look at the economics of this, the single biggest cost, other than the actual cost of the generation, but the single biggest operating cost to a retailer is churn. In Victoria, at times there was 25% churn of customers, and so 1 in 4 customers is leaving you every year. The cost of acquiring an individual customer was, on average, around $140. Now that can range from online customers to different channels, but let's call it $140. So If 25% of your customer base is churning every year and you have 2 million customers, you've got to acquire 500,000 more customers every year to stay in one place. That's about $80 million of OPEX just to stand still. So you're burning cash just to maintain your 2 million customer base. You need that 2 million customer base because you've got to sell that generation to someone. So they're hedging your generation. So by making someone more efficient, but engaging them in a longer relationship than just an annual churn, you're actually assuring yourself of the offtake for your generation and therefore both de-risking your business, but reducing the single biggest OPEX to your business. Yeah, an energy efficiency dividend of 5%, 10% will keep a customer loyal if it is presented to them in the right way. And that's a much cheaper way of maintaining loyalty than going out and replacing that customer and paying a door knocker or whoever it was at the time to go and bring that other customer on board. So the economic reality is that energy efficiency in itself, yes, it's difficult to justify that until you look at it in terms of customer loyalty.
Rashika, what are your thoughts on that question?
Well, again, I agree with Richard. I mean, we have a variety of different both regulatory and then operational requirements that force us to look at customers in very similar ways. So we're constantly being held accountable to what we call asset utilization standards. And the three networks, CitiPower, Powercor, and United Energy, have some of the highest asset utilization rates in the country, which is effectively means that you want to build assets to serve the customers in their needs, and ensure reliability 99.99, 99.97% of the time without overbuilding, right? So if there are areas where we can provide energy efficiency, demand response, behind the meter programs that allow us to increase our asset utilization and provide value back to the customer, that makes sense for us as a network, absolutely. And then there's also generally, at a more strategic level, protecting our social license to operate. If we don't actually step into a role of enabling customer desires, needs, wants associated with electricity use outside of this, traditional concept of reliability, we will be relegated down to poles and wires management at some point if we don't provide a customer value proposition that allows consumers to take advantage of whatever it is that they want to do with their electricity. As David mentioned, whether it's peer-to-peer trading, solar, or be a more passive consumer of electricity, we have to cater for all of those needs. And if we don't, then policy or regulatory change will come down and remove that away from us, remove that away from our regulated asset base. So it's in our best interest and the best interest of our shareholders to actually meet customer needs and put customers at the heart of what it is that we're trying to accomplish.
David, would you like to address this issue from the framing it around trust, customer trust of their provider?
Yes, I think that what's being described by the person who I think said they came from the UK is a negative spiral where there's no trust and that maybe the businesses aren't properly selling the idea of using less, and that engenders more trust, more lack of trust, etc., etc. I think I agree with everything that my colleagues have said so far. What I'd also add is that what it does mean is that if you're getting your revenue just based solely on the amount of units of energy that you sell, perhaps you somehow need to change your revenue model so that you can actually make money from other things. Because as energy efficiency increases, as people self-generate, then maybe there is a need to move the business model. I'd also like to remind people that it's not in anybody's interest to levy a customer bill higher than it really needs to be, and certainly not levying a bill that customers can't afford to pay. That really doesn't help anybody. So those are things and if a customer, as it's been said, finds that other retailers are offering more advice on that kind of thing, then yes, they're going to trust those as instead. And it only needs one person to find that out. They'll tell 10 of their friends. They'll tell 10 of their friends, and it's not a sustainable position for a retailer to be in, to be simply perceived to be taking advantage of their customers.
Thank you, David. Richard, on this issue, I know you have a few slides on customer transparency. Maybe we can share them right now, if you could, if you like.
Yeah. The issue is for customers is they're not being given any assistance from the retailers as to what to do. There's a lot of confusion out there. I don't know if the slides have come up yet. It's slide number 8. There's a lot of confusion out there. For example, solar. People buy whatever solar is sold to them because they're making a reaction. They want to buy solar. And someone tells them, we can plaster your rooftop with panels. It's not going to cost you that much. So get as much as you can. So what we've done is we've developed, using a simple little monitoring device, the ability to analyze customers' usage in real time and take that data and provide valuable input back to the customer. So we can do this off our EdgeConnect energy monitoring device. We read the energy consumption of your household and different major appliances in real time. And here's an example. There's 2 homes here. Mine's unfortunately the one on the right. I've got 3 teenage kids, as has the home on the left. It just gives you an idea of the benefits of data and then the actions from that. So on the left, the energy cost, daily energy cost is $2.31. Mine is $15. I have a very inefficient home with no solar, no battery, and actually no LED lighting. They can't put LED lighting at the moment because of COVID. But my graph is on the bottom. That's my consumption graph. Peaks in the evening, like most consumption graphs. The consumption graph from my colleague in the middle who has solar, he started to move his consumption, the black line shows consumption, more into the middle of the day and use his appliances during the middle of the day when he's generating solar. Now, if you flick to the next slide, you can see the consumption, the time of use consumption David was talking about. So slide 9, please. David was talking about the duck curve. Well, you can see a bit of a duck curve on that top one. But he's actually starting to use more consumption during the day. He uses less at night. Mine is at the bottom, is very clear. I use a lot in the evening, 45% between 5 and 10. So we look at this and then we run an algorithm that says, if you flick to the next slide, what are the potential savings from putting in solar or battery or switching here? So the home on the top comes out with the conclusion that a tariff switch to a better tariff structure to his usage profile would save him around $450 a year. And he could also put in a 4 to 5 kilowatt battery to save that $450 a year. He doesn't need a Tesla Powerwall. He needs a smaller battery because his usage in the evening is relatively low. On the other hand, the house at the bottom needs LED lighting, it needs solar, and it needs a full battery there. The savings potential there using this data is $4,500 a year. Now, this data is available from smart meters, but it hasn't been translated from those smart meters into customer-friendly data in Victoria. And elsewhere where there aren't smart meters, it can be collected from a simple monitoring device like our EdgeConnect monitoring device. The retailers are being lazy. They're not delivering this advice to the customers. They're just churning customers based on price and energy price and offering ever more confusing discounts. They're being lazy. They're not using the data they have to actually deliver useful solutions for customers like you see here.
Rashika, as a provider, as a distributor, what are your thoughts on the data that Richard just discussed?
Look, I mean, yeah, this data is available. Many different, we have a portal that provides, load profile, real-time load profile use for end-use customers, and it gives them insight into their generation. Most retailers have some kind of portal. They don't do, what David's talking about in terms of taking it to that next step and analyzing investment decisions on behalf of the consumer, which I think is very valuable. I think the challenge is for the electricity sector, because of where we sit, because of the mistrust and I call it the distrust halo that distribution companies get caught in as well across the sector, is consumers. We need to find the right messaging. We need to find how we can use and capture more share of voice. Because, just simply generating value for customers that isn't relevant to them or isn't perceived as being relevant to them isn't going to cut it. I mean, right now, if you go onto Victorian Energy Compare, which is a government website, and compare tariffs, something like 50% of Victorians could save $240 a year just by switching their retailers. But they're not doing it because there's no perceived compelling reason for them to do this. Absolutely, we should be getting more insights in front of consumers, and absolutely, it's about making sure that it's clear and how that generates value for them. But there is also a messaging piece and a trust piece that we've talked about that I don't think we've cracked yet, in terms of saying, this is relevant for you. You should do this. You need to get up and invest in, or get up and call your retailer. And the industry hasn't really found out what that positioning is yet.
Okay, I want to dig a little bit more into customer messaging, and I want to do two things now. I'm going to lead that with a question for David, and then once I read the question, can we put up the survey question number 2? So the question, David, I'd like you to address, because we're going to start talking about customer messaging, is a consumer. Why would a consumer inconvenience themselves when the network gets the benefit? Why would they do something to benefit the network when they might maybe see 1/1,000,000th of the benefit in their bill?
Thanks. Yes, that's an interesting question. And although it's been said before that consumers will only do things if they can see a benefit for them, I'm not sure that that's fully the whole story. Think back to when we had a drought in Victoria, and it's been the same in other places in Australia and in the world. What was the messaging to save water? It wasn't use less water so you'll get a lower bill. It was use less water because that's the good thing to do for the community, because we all need the water. I know of one network in the Melbourne area which did a trial of a demand side project with customers probably a couple of years ago now, where what they did was they said, if you reduce your usage at particular peak times when we ask you to, we'll give a donation to a local charity of your choice, or we'll give a donation to a local school or a community project. And people did actually respond positively to that. Not everybody is necessarily as mercenary as we think they are, that all they want is a benefit for themselves. If you can persuade them that actually, and they really understand that there is a community benefit and there's something bigger than themselves, people will actually react to that and feel good about it. And so there are ways of doing it, but at the moment, people just don't know what to do, when to do it. The messaging just isn't there for them. It's the messaging as to what can I do to help and how will it help, rather than how many dollars and cents are there in it for me.
Okay, expanding on this, and we talked about this at length when we were speaking privately. Why are there so many confusing messages out there? And I'd like to start with Richard on that, but as we're doing that, can we show the survey results? Richard?
There's confusing messages out there because of the structure of the industry. When it was deregulated in the 90s, no one anticipated renewables and the changes. Everyone thought this industry's been around for a long time. We'll deregulate in order to drive cost out of the industry and make it more efficient. But in doing that, they hadn't anticipated the new technologies that have come on board, and in a way, they set that industry up. And it's very difficult to change because you've got different owners of generation and transmission and distribution and retail customers. And by separating that ownership out, it's so difficult to get an end-to-end solution. If you go to countries where they still have that single utility, it's a diabolical situation because it may be inefficient, but actually making end-to-end change when you have new technology is a lot easier in that environment. The problem here is you've got lots of vested interests with different drivers. As a retailer, I was making revenue out of my retail customers and then buying the electricity. I was a generator and making revenue out of converting coal and gas into electrons. As a distribution company, Rishika's making money based on the amount of capital that they've invested, and that's in certain areas. And New South Wales, a classic example of this, with Ausgrid in the 2000s, a massive overinvestment in the network there, which was government owned, with different incentives behind that investment, because it resulted in big dividends back to the government. So you've got those different incentives from that deregulated industry, which is then compounding the problem of adoption of new technology. And actually, just as a point, David, in terms of mercenary customers, I agree customers are not altogether mercenary. However, I disagree that customers are going to be willing to pay for what they perceive to be someone else's poor planning.
Okay. We had some discussions about how concrete examples about how messaging on solar PV usage and the connection to the distributor was creating real distrust. And I don't like to keep on harping on this trust issue, but Rishika, can you start answering that? What's going on with the adoption of solar PV by the consumer, and why are the messages confusing the consumers?
Well, it's exactly what Richard said. It's a split incentive around all of the different industry players that come together to provide that solution. So I think you really need strong leadership to coordinate those different industry players and say, there needs to be cross-industry collaboration. There needs to be collaboration, as I mentioned, all the way from policy initiatives through to the network transmission distribution networks, through to the installers, retailers, etc., and even post-installation management. The lack of transparency is only, as an industry, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. If there isn't transparency and engagement around solar adoption, and someone has, perhaps a negative experience with us and their connection of solar PV, when we then go to them and say, we have an LV DERMS platform where we can help you maximize your investment, their only interaction with us is going to have been potentially a negative one. Where's their incentive, exactly as some of the people have mentioned in their comments, to then engage with us and allow for that joint and collaborative effort to manage power quality in their area in a way that's better for consumers and better for the network. So the challenge is, where does that leadership come from? Who's responsible for providing that leadership? Who's responsible for coordinating the effort across the value chain? I don't necessarily have a perfect response to that.
There probably is not one. So I suppose, David, this is what when we talk about a holistic approach, this is where it's really needed in addressing these types of issues. Would I be correct in assuming that?
Absolutely. Holistic approach is definitely what's needed. I mean, some of this comes down to the lack of a federal government energy policy in this country. There's no real, there's been some renewable energy targets, but they've largely run their course. What is the government's energy policy? Is it sustainables? Is it funding a new gas plant? Is it in some parts of the country even possibly wanting to start a new coal mine and new coal generation, which isn't likely to happen? But the message is as confusing. There isn't the leadership coming directly from governments. And it's not therefore coming, and then state and territorial governments have different views again. They have policies, they have zero gas or 100% renewable, net zero, whatever their policies are. And then you have IEMO trying desperately to make sure that for now and looking into the future, the energy system remains on and remains stable. And you have everybody else trying to do their bit around it. And it's just very, very confusing. The messaging then, the press will always pick up on what they perceive to be differences in opinion of things, and they're having a field day. They could fill the newspapers for months with stories about how angry consumers, I invested in this energy system and now they're going to turn it off, or I were invested on this system such that I would have zero energy charges, but look what those people have done. They've increased the fixed charge and decreased the unit charge. So I'm now getting bills where I didn't expect them because I did my calculations based on a different assumption. It's a moving world, and we haven't got the consistent leadership and the consistent messaging. And a lot of people are trying desperately to fix this, but it's not happening so easily.
Well, you just said something that, I'm sorry,
just
David,
to add the very last thing. Some people have said it's a lack of, it can be because we don't have a carbon policy. Actually say the carbon policy is being made for us. And it's largely being made by the banks and the financiers and the insurers, making their positions clear as to what they'll finance and what they'll insure. And that's an example of people coming in the absence of strong leadership from governments.
Well, by mentioning carbon policy, I suppose you've led us into some potentially dangerous waters or controversial waters. Richard, any comments on the lack of carbon policy? Or do you have? Is there a carbon policy?
There is no carbon, but yeah, David is absolutely correct. The lack of a carbon policy is actually the root cause of a lot of the challenges we have in terms of network stability, integrity, and the like. Because without a firm understanding of where you're going over the next, not 5 years, but 15, 20, 25 years, because all of our assets are long-term assets. If you don't have a consistent position there, how can you possibly plan? How can you plan to build a new generation plant when you don't know what the carbon policy is going to be from one government to the next? All you know is that in the absence of that federal carbon policy, you're going to have different state governments introducing different state-based politically driven incentives that may be pushing certain generation in areas. They may be promoting solar. They may be, different. The nature abhors a vacuum, and carbon policy absolutely abhors a vacuum. People rush in with their ideas, and that's the problem we have. Is that you've had massive stimulus into one area, then you've had neglect in another area. The grid stability is being compromised by the lack of federal carbon policy, and I think it's just a woeful indictment on the federal government that they haven't been able to get their act together on this. In my time here, in the last 15 years, we've flip-flopped backwards and forwards with a CPRS and a carbon tax and a reform, and try making $1 billion investment on that basis. It's pretty challenging because, as we've seen with those solar projects, the grid solar projects in Victoria, up in the rhombus of regret around Ballarat and Bendigo and that area, people have seen significant, and I'm talking hundreds of millions of dollars swings in the value of those assets based on changes or regulatory changes in marginal loss factor. But these are changes that would be much easier to accommodate if we had a firm view on what the carbon policy was.
100%. Couldn't agree more. Rashika, we just had a question come in, which I think you're well positioned to answer. The question is, how do we create a transparent process for customers to provide grid services to the networks, given what they want? Reliability at a lower cost. It's different than what they've traditionally been incentivized to do.
So if I interpret that correctly, it's about incentivizing networks differently as opposed to, or also potentially having customers be able to work collaboratively with the network. And I think I'll break it down into two parts. I think, first of all, networks need to step out from behind the shadow of retailers more. We can't be entrusted to have a relationship with consumers if there's no awareness around who we are and what we do and how we provide value to consumers. We also need to do more to understand how customers are valuable to us as networks. So, we're a regulated industry. We've got a geographic footprint. Customers located in different areas that are linked to different assets have different value to us. We as an industry need to understand how to leverage that value collaboratively with the consumer. If you're on a feeder or if you're on a transformer where there's energy risk, how do we engage with you and manage that energy risk in a cost-effective manner, as opposed to someone who lives in the middle of the city where there's a different level of reliability. Segmentation of customer. I mean, it's about exactly as Richard said over and over again. The more we can take a human-centered design approach to this, the more we can put customer outcomes at the center of our decision making, the more we'll actually be able to weather the changes that are occurring in the industry successfully and be able to update our business model again so that we maintain our license to operate.
Okay, we're down to our last few minutes, and I want to ask each of you to comment for about a minute or less on this next question, which is specifically, why is regulation not keeping up with the industry drivers we spoke about to open this webcast? Let's start with David, and keep in mind we've got about 1 minute each.
Very much because the things are changing faster than we expected them to. Things are happening that were never expected when we put in place the original legislation and regulation, and often nowadays the actual practices in an industry will be ahead of the legislation and regulation. Think internet copyright, think about the news services that are being put out by Facebook and Google and other social media. Think about the regulation of defamatory things on social media. All these things, the practices go well ahead of the laws and regulations behind them. It's the way the world's moving nowadays.
Richard, your thoughts on that?
3 things. Technology change is way more rapid than regulators can keep up with. And it's that technology changes. We're just starting to see it, and there's a wave in generation in our industry, and there's a wave that is affecting our industry from other adjacent industries. And communications and communications change as well. Second thing is that customers' expectations driven by other industries, whether it's the Uberization or Googleization or Netflixization, customers' expectations in terms of service are changing dramatically, and how they need to be serviced. And the third element is the financial stress that the incumbents are under, because we have a very fragmented industry. Actually, most countries would have 2 or 3 players. We have 26 different retailers and different generators. The financial stress that the incumbents are under mean that they are unable to make the investment to accommodate that technology change and the customer expectations. So I actually see this resulting in really the death of the retailer as we see them, and new data players who understand the customer's needs and use customer data to deliver the customer solutions will come and take over there. We'll still have the networks, and they'll be much more customer focused. We'll still have generation in whatever form, but I think the current form of the current retail situation is not a great place for them to be.
Well, that's a fascinating insight, the death of the retailer. Rashika, what are your thoughts?
So continuing in with the theme of the panel discussion, violent agreement with my panelists. The only other thing that I would add to that is there needs to be a culture shift within the industry and within specific industry organizations as well. I think there is still a lack of diversity of thought. There needs to be more of a commercial mindset in some areas, particularly network distribution companies. They need to start thinking about traditional consumer engagement, stakeholder engagement, and incorporating that not only from a consultative perspective and an informative perspective, but truly trying to understand exactly, as my panelists have said, what is the future state 10, 20 years down the road, and how do we design an industry and a network that's going to be able to accommodate that in the best long-term interest of consumers, which is what the NEO is there for. So that culture change, different skill sets, digital skill sets, consumer skill sets, that isn't occurring as rapidly as it should in the industry, from my perspective. So a diversity of thought, particularly at leadership levels, is required.
Well, who would have thought an hour could go so quickly? What a great conversation. I thank each of you for your participation. I know you took a lot of time to prepare for this and to participate, so thank you, David, Richard, and Rashika. My personal thanks, and we got some great audience questions, so you really touched on some hot points. So thanks. I'd like to remind everyone that there's a recording of today's webinar. There will be a recording, as well as the other digital interviews and presentations that we're doing. And they're available on our website, which I mentioned earlier. It's enlit-australia.com. Please join us at our live event in Melbourne, and we're very confident we'll go forward, restrictions allowing, on March 10th and 11th at Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Center, Conference and Exhibition Center. If you'd like any other information about Enlit Australia, contact any of us on the team. You see us, our contact information is on the screen. Happy to talk to you about it. We're quite excited. The program's shaping up beautifully. You have a lot of really good speakers, and we have some interesting people coming in from overseas. So again, thanks everybody. We will see you all hopefully in Melbourne. Thanks panelists, and everyone have a good evening.
Thanks all.